As I mentioned in the earlier video about how to set up to knit in the round, I have been doing many of these cat-eared projects. This is hat number 18 in my hands. And as I've been doing it, I've been trying to think about some of the processes. The way this hat works is it's knit in the round, and then I am finishing the top by finishing off with a Kitchener stitch. The Kitchener stitch is one of those that I've used a lot. It's not that hard to do, but I always find I have to look it up. And after doing this project and thinking through it and kind of breaking it down as to what it is I'm doing as I'm doing this process, I came up with a couple of thoughts that might be helpful to other people. To begin with, I'm not going to do the start quite yet. I'm going to show you how to start in a moment, but I want to just look at the Kitchener stitch itself. It is a 4-step process. It's with a needle that is threaded with the working yarn, and you have 2 needles. Your stitches are divided evenly between the 2 needles. You have a needle in front and a needle in back. You will be doing a knit and a purl or a purl and a knit. The first stitch is always removed, the second stitch on the needle stays on. So for each needle, you do a stitch to remove the first stitch, and then you do a stitch to anchor the second stitch, and then you move to the other needle. The trick is to remember which way do you go. It's either a purl and a knit and purl. So what I have discovered is that when you look at your knitting, you have your stockinette, you have your knit stitches on the front needle. If you look at the back, you see the purl stitches. Although this is knit in the round and it's always the right side, when you have the needles facing you this way, you can see the right side and the wrong side. So on the right side, typically for stockinette, the first thing you do is a knit. For the wrong side, typically in stockinette, you do a purl. So just by looking at your stitches, you know which one to do first. So it is basically to insert the needle knitwise because we're on the front needle with the, looks like the right side, and that's our first step. Our second step is to insert the needle purlwise, opposite of what we just have done. Oh, I almost forgot something, you gotta take that off. This one we insert purlwise, keep it on. Back needle, it looks like the wrong side. We insert the needle purlwise, slip it off. That's the third step. And the fourth step is to insert the needle knitwise on the back and keep it on. So it's basically off, on, off, on. Some people will walk through it that way by saying off, on, off, on. Or some people will say knit, purl, purl, knit. Or some people might say knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. What I say, and I don't know why this works for me, but it does, it's weird, but it works for me, is I have in my head, once I've done it a couple times, what the first, second, third, fourth step is. And somehow, when I just count out 1, 2, 3, 4, it helps me remember where I am. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And why that works for me, I don't know. You could say 1 off, 2 on, 3 off, 4, on, whatever works for you. But for some reason, that 1, 2, 3, 4 has just made it easier for me to remember where I am in the process, and that's been working well for me. But as I said, knowing what to start with helps by knowing where you are. Where you start with a knit when you're on the right side, and you start with a purl on the wrong side. Now, to start out this whole process, this is hat number 19. Basically, we're knitting in the round, and I'm coming to the end of the round here, and this is my last round. And so here's my start of round marker. I'm going to take that off, and I have my stitches in the round, but here I have a marker, so that is half the stitches here. It's too many stitches right now to pull the needle out, but when I get to the end, what I'll do is I'll get to where the marker is when I get fewer stitches on the needle and pull that out, and I'll have my stitches divided evenly between the two needles. But for now, I just have a stitch marker there. I have the working yarn has just come off the back needle. I've just finished that stitch. That's the last stitch of the final round. This is the first stitch of the final round. And so what I need to do is I need to get a working thread. So what I'm going to do is take off a fair amount. I don't want to have too little, because there's nothing worse than running out of this yarn when you're in the middle of doing the Kitchener stitch. But I take out a healthy amount, maybe 3 times or whatever the amount. And I'm going to thread that onto a darning needle. And ridiculously long thread here, but I'd rather have that than have to add another thread as I go. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the process, not how we were doing the Kitchener stitch before. Remember, we started with a purl, then a knit, and then a knit, then a purl, and then a purl, then a knit, with this one coming off, this one staying on, this one coming off, this one staying on. What we're really going to do is the second part of each needle. That we did 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to do 2 and 4. We don't take the first stitch off, so the first stitch is as if it didn't exist, and then we're going to knit this one purlwise and leave it on. So if we were in the middle of the Kitchener stitch, that would have been our second move, not our first move. Going to the back needle, if we were in the middle of the Kitchener stitch, our first move would be to purl and pull it off, but our second move would be just to knit and keep it on. So basically, we're just doing the second move for each of the needles. Now, we're going to go as if we're doing the Kitchener stitch like we just were doing. We have our knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on, or we could say off, on, off, on. Or if for some reason your brain works like mine, you could just say 1, 2, 3, 4. Where 1 is knit off, 2, purl on, 3 on the back needle is purl off, 4 is knit on. Now, you don't want to be too loose, but then you don't want to be too tight either. So this basically starts to look like a row of stitches. If it's too loose, you might want to give it a little tug as you go along, or you could try to tighten it up a little bit with your needle. But the best thing is to try to keep an even tension, just as you do with your knitting, all the way across, so it's not too loose and not too tight. Now, some people will actually jump into this just doing the regular Kitchener stitch, where they just start with the knit off, purl on, and they claim that it's a smoother edge if you do that. For this purpose, I need to have kind of pointy ears, so it's been fine for me. But that's another option. You can, if you're doing socks or something like that, you might want to perhaps try that and see if you like that. Now, to finish it off, we'll go to hat number 20 that I've done. And here I've got just a few stitches left on these needles. You see I've got my markers still there, but now it's divided between the two needles. And I have the first stitch, or the knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on, now this is getting tricky because we're running out of stitches and you don't want things to fall off, so I kind of keep my finger on this one. It's knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. And so now there are some people who will just, you have these stitches anchored here from your second step of the Kitchener stitch, and some people will actually just take these off and put the needle down. The traditional way of finishing it is just like you would finish any other Kitchener stitch. We come back to this and we knit off, although there's no stitch left here to do our purl on, so we skip that step. And then we go to the second needle and do the purl off. And same thing, we don't have another stitch to do the knit on. And then we have this little tag here. So what I have been doing is actually taking my needle behind the stitch, coming back in through, and really giving it a good tug. And that has been bringing that in. And then I can see it's in here. And now I can anchor this down. Great, I've just done something very clever here with my yarn, haven't I? So now I can go ahead and anchor this down here and weave in my ends. So that's that little ear that I pulled through. So now I have lots of different colors and lots of different ends, but that's a different story and a different headache. But I just thought I'd show a few things that I have discovered with the Kitchener stitch, and having done 20 of these hats, I do believe that I will be able to now do the Kitchener stitch without having to ever look it up again.